Hello, I'm Margaret MacMillan. Part of being a leader is you sometimes have to take awkward decisions, difficult decisions, and you sometimes have to take risks. If you avoid difficult decisions, sometimes they come back to haunt you. Chapter 3, risk-taking, calculating the odds. Not easy and very difficult, and you may be facing terrible consequences, but sometimes those decisions have to be made. And sometimes you have to take such risks.
Well, I agree that the communists are rats.
Richard Nixon is now today remembered as Tricky Dick. He's remembered as the man who had the Watergate scandal attached to his name, the man who was forced out of office because it turned out he was trying to use the powers of the presidency to cover up dirty tricks, and he had to resign. But I think he should also be remembered for a considerable act of statesmanship, and that was the opening to China. China and the United States had had virtually no relationship since 1949. This was not good for either country, and it was certainly not good for the stability of the world. Now, this was not an easy thing to do because there was strong anti-Chinese communist feeling in the United States, and Richard Nixon was taking considerable political risk. Richard Nixon was elected in the fall of 1968, took office in 1969, and immediately began to put out feelers to the Chinese communists. Now, this wasn't easy because the United States and China had no direct relationship. And so what he did is he operated through countries which already had a relationship with China. And so a letter would be sent to Pakistan from Beijing. It would be sent from Pakistan to Washington. The Pakistan ambassador in Washington would take it to the White House, and then another reply would be sent back through the same route. And gradually the rhetoric began to get lower. But Richard Nixon, I think, also took a risk in actually flying to China. He didn't know when he got on his airplane in Washington that whether or not he would meet Chairman Mao. It hadn't been confirmed. If Nixon had been humiliated in China by, for example, a refusal of Chairman Mao to meet him, he would have looked foolish and he would have looked weak. And that would have been very bad for him politically in the United States, and it would have been very bad with American allies. When the plane landed in Beijing, and waiting for him at the bottom was Zhou Enlai, the Chinese Prime Minister and Foreign Minister. And Nixon came down, you can see it in the photographs, with his hand outstretched, and shook hands very publicly and very obviously with Zhou Enlai. And this was very deliberately done to make up for a handshake that never took place in 1954. In 1954, Zhou Enlai and the then US Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, had met at Geneva, and John Foster Dulles had walked straight by Zhou Enlai, who had his hand outstretched and refused to shake his hand. And so you can see in the pictures, Nixon is determined to make up for that slight. After the handshake with Zhou Enlai, Nixon was taken in a motorcade through Beijing, and they settled into their villa, and they were still wondering about whether or not they would see Mao. And Mao suddenly sent word to Zhou Enlai, who was with Nixon, saying, "Invite Nixon to come and have tea with me." And so Nixon and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, and a couple of others jumped into a Chinese limousine and sped off, much to the consternation of American Secret Servicemen who saw their president disappearing without any of them there to protect him. Off they went. They had tea with Mao. They talked about this and that. What was important was that it took place, and there were pictures of it, and it was back on American news. And the upshot of normal relations between China and the United States was increased cultural exchanges and, importantly, increased trade and investment. On that trip, the Chinese really laid themselves out to welcome the Americans, and the Americans laid themselves out to be good guests. And so there were banquets in the Great Hall of the People where they toasted each other and they toasted each other's countries, and the Chinese military bands had carefully learned American music, so they played things like the Stars and Stripes Forever, and I believe they played How Much Is That Doggy in the Window. They really were trying to appeal to the Americans. Nixon took an entourage with him. He took, of course, his wife, Pat Nixon, who was advised, interestingly enough, not to wear red, because red traditionally in China had been the color that prostitutes wore. And she wisely defied that advice, which came from the old China hands, and wore a beautiful bright red coat. And she looks terrific. She got off the airplane, and you immediately see Pat Nixon in her wonderful red coat.
It's the best part of my job.
But I think if you're looking at present-day leaders, I think Justin Trudeau took a risk in the last election in Canada.
Our plan features 3 years of historic involvement.
When he announced that the Liberal platform included deficit spending on infrastructure.
I'm tired of watching governments put that debt on the backs of future generations.
A modest deficit, and only for 3 years.
Both other parties were very much pushing a line of we will balance the budget, there will be no debt, there will be no deficit spending. And a lot of people at the time said this is reckless. The Canadian taxpayer won't go for it.
That growth will eliminate...
A lot of the advice to Trudeau was don't talk about a deficit. The public doesn't like it.
Once you open up this can of worms...
The general view in the media was, you know, they've lost it.
Trudeau is betting that voters...
I mean, they've lost the sense and they've lost the election.
They'll soon find out if their gamble pays off.
And, you know, I think Canadians understand that we do sometimes go into debt to do something we see as important. I mean, most of us have had mortgages if we've bought property, and that's deficit spending. But I think it was a calculated risk. I don't think it was a foolish risk.
I, Justin P.J. Trudeau, do swear...
Well, look, as far as the election was concerned, it seems to have paid off. Yeah, I think those who take risks are, in a sense, gamblers, but they're clever gamblers and stupid gamblers. But, you know, if you think of it, politicians in democratic societies are all risk takers. You wouldn't go into that profession unless you were a bit of a gambler.
In the front line, take the don'ts.
You live a life full of risk if you're a politician. Thanks for watching. To view the next video in the Art of Leading series, just click here. Go on, it's good stuff.
The lady's not for turning.
And she refused to back down. And the nickname that began to go around was Attila the Hen.